Thanks for being here, everyone. This is another great program from the School of Labor and Urban Studies. We're here to assess the arc of the first avowedly progressive administration in New York City since the Dinkins administration departed in January 1994. In November of 2013, Bill de Blasio managed to win office not only with the strong support from minority neighborhoods and white liberals, but also from a large share of the white Democrats who had previously defected from Democratic mayoral nominees to support Republican candidates. He came into office highlighting the importance of bridging the gaps between the two cities and building up programs that would improve life for ordinary working New Yorkers. In the past 8 years, city government has taken many steps in that direction, but it's fair to say that as the mayor leaves office in a few short months, that he has disappointed some of his initial supporters. Today, we're here to explore what went right, what went wrong, and what wasn't tried that should have been tried with 4 leading experts and advocates on key policy areas. As you've just heard, they are Leonie Hampson, Executive Director of Class Size Matters, who works on many aspects of K-12 public education in New York City. Jose Ortiz, who is the CEO of the New York City Employment and Training Coalition, which advocates on behalf of the workforce development programs in New York City. Julian Harris Calvin, who's the director of the Greater Justice New York project at the Vera Institute of Justice, whose focus is on reforming incarceration and helping people who've been formerly incarcerated reintegrate into life successfully. And James Rodriguez, who's our professor of urban studies at SLU, who's been working on neighborhood development, public housing, and gentrification. Let me step right into turning to Leonie Hampson, and she is going to share a screen to share a short presentation with us. Everybody will get a chance to introduce their main ideas for about 5 minutes or so. And then we'll turn to a more general conversation. I'll ask each presenter some questions specifically on their areas after they've made their short presentations. And then after everybody's presented their perspectives, we'll have some general conversation. And towards the end, the audience will be able to submit questions as well. And as you've heard, please submit them in the chat function. So Leonie, let me turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me, John and CUNY. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, and I think we can see your shared screen as well.
Okay, great. I am covered over by the things at the tops, but I'll just go with it this way.
You might want to start the slideshow so that
I know, but the Zoom controls cover over where that happens. So it's somewhere hidden. So I will have to do it this way, but thank you again. I'm going to go through a bunch of slides rather quickly because I only have 5 minutes, but hope there's more issues that can be covered during the question time. So when he first ran for mayor, Bill de Blasio portrayed himself as a leader who would make a whole raft of progressive changes in our public schools, yet his record in education is mixed. He promised, first of all, to give parents and communities more voice, to give his appointees on the panel for educational policy, which is our school board, 2-year terms and not to fire them at will, which happened under Bloomberg. He said he would allow the parent-led community education councils to have votes on school closures and co-locations, and that their views would be taken into account by the panel before they voted on these proposals. Neither of those things have happened, and parents and communities remain largely powerless and without a voice. And the PAP remains largely a rubber stamp body with a supermajority of mayoral appointees who almost never reject a school closing, co-location, budgetary allocation, or contract. Diversity and integration, of course, is an important issue. Our schools are about the most segregated in the nation, in part because of housing segregation, but also because especially middle schools and high schools rely on high stakes tests to screen and sort students which have discriminatory results. When he ran for mayor, he said he would be increasing diversity, especially in our specialized high schools, which are highly segregated right now and make up mostly white and Asian students. Now, state law controls admissions at 3 of these 8 high schools, but de Blasio controls them in the other 5. And he has refused to make any changes to make admissions more equitable or less reliant on high stakes exam. He also formed a school diversity advisory group, but rejected most of their proposals and recommendations, including eliminated gifting classes, which are overwhelmingly white and Asian and based upon an exam given at 4 years old. And also they advised him to eliminate middle school admission screens and make high school enrollments more reflective of the diversity, of the city's diversity as a whole. He also promised to expand pre-K and lower class size when he ran for mayor. He has provided publicly funded pre-K for all 4-year-old children and is now expanding 3K. But he also pledged to lower class size significantly and provide the funding to do so, and said nothing will help our schools more than lowering class size. But this has not occurred. Neither has he worked to seriously alleviate school overcrowding, reform the school capacity formula to allow for space for smaller classes. And in fact, the way he administered the pre-K expansion led to worse overcrowding in our elementary schools for about 236 students, instead of providing more space for 3K and 4K in neighborhood-based CBOs that had the space. So why is class size reduction so important, especially for disadvantaged children? It is a key driver of equity because the research shows that smaller classes lead to better grades, test scores, stronger engagement, less disciplinary problems, less teacher attrition, higher graduation rates, but especially for those kids who need the help the most. And that's why it's one of only a handful of reforms that have proven to narrow the achievement gap between economic and racial groups. And some economists estimate that the benefits are twice the cost, especially for low-income students and students of color. And our state's highest court, in the Campaign for Fiscal Equity lawsuit, said specifically that our class sizes were too large in New York City to provide children with their constitutional right to a sound basic education. And here's a quote from the lawsuit. Yet our class sizes remain 15 to 30% higher on average than the rest of the state. And this is a chart that shows that. What's happened to class size? Since 2007, class sizes went up dramatically, especially in the lower grades, and have not been reduced significantly during this administration. That was grades 3 through 6. This is grades 4 through 8. This is high school class sizes. The lower lines in red was what the city originally promised to reduce them to. And the averages don't tell the whole story. More than 300,000 students were in classes of 30 or more in October 2019 before the pandemic hit. The need for smaller classes and the opportunity to reduce class size was unprecedented this year. Smaller classes would provide the social distancing that the CDC recommends, as well as the stronger support that our students desperately need after 1.5 years of disrupted learning. And the opportunity was there because our schools are receiving an additional $8 billion in state and federal funds over the next 3 years. The federal funds were supposed to pay for health, safety, and education policies to help students recover from losses and keep them safe. And the state funds are coming as a result of the CFE lawsuit, which I just mentioned. This year, an extra $530 million, rising to $1.3 billion annually over the next 3 years to fulfill the goals of the CFE lawsuit, in which class size was central to the court's decision. What happened? The city council, in recognition of the need for smaller classes, and because of the additional resources, pushed hard in the budget for at least $250 million to be spent on class size reduction, but the mayor refused. Instead, the DOE is spending $18 million for a class size pilot in which a small number of elementary schools can hire teachers either to lower class size or push into existing classes. Of course, push-in teachers do not provide the same level of safety. They make the classrooms more overcrowded, not less, and research has not shown them to yield the same benefits as lowering class size. Now, there are a lot of other issues that are important: the overuse of standardized testing, lack of budgetary and policy transparency, charter school growth, over-policing and discipline in our schools, school overcrowding, and student outcomes, which I'm happy to talk about later in the questions section. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that, Lanny. You pointed out the failure to make progress on your key issue of class size, but I wonder if you could also comment on whether the de Blasio administration did anything that you think went right. And in particular, I'm interested in the extent to which the city was able to shift from the Bloomberg era model of competition and choice and closing underperforming schools, sort of applying a market model to the school system. De Blasio clearly wanted to move away from that, but his main program, Renewal Schools, which was designed to help the underperforming schools, didn't seem to accomplish as much as was hoped for initially. And I wonder if you could tell us why you think that was.
Well, a couple things. He did promise to put a moratorium on closing schools, but they did close schools during his administration. Some of them transfer schools, for example, for highly disadvantaged kids who'd already dropped out of school. Not to the extent that Bloomberg did, but school closures did continue. The renewal program, I did a lot of research on. As part of their promises to the state over CFE, they promised to focus all their efforts on reducing class size in the renewal schools. And yet we found that 60% or more of the renewal schools did not lower class size by even one student per class. And many of them continued to have classes of 30 or more. We did a statistical analysis showing that those who did lower class size were far more likely to succeed and come off the renewal list. So they made promises to address some of the most important issues in our schools, in the renewal schools. They did not follow through with those promises. And the consensus was that as a whole, that policy, that priority, that program failed.
Great, thanks. So, all across urban America, there are substantial achievement gaps between working class and minority students from working class and minority neighborhoods and kids who come from more privileged middle and upper class families and neighborhoods, and closing that gap and bringing more students to, for example, Regents diploma level has been a challenge not only for New York City, but across the country. And I'm wondering, obviously, class size in your analysis is a very focal lever for changing that. But I wonder what other things you think we should be considering at this point to make more progress on that.
Danny Drum, who's a former teacher and chair of the City Council Finance Committee and formerly chair of the Education Committee, said we've tried everything but class size reduction. So why don't we try that? Obviously, there are other things that could help, and they have made a little bit of progress in terms of hiring more school counselors. They've made some progress in hiring more social workers this year. They've made some progress over school discipline and policing, but not enough. One of the things that there was a very active campaign around was to lower the number of school safety agents who are hired and trained by the police and now outnumber both counselors and social workers combined in our schools. And de Blasio resisted that. And they have not cut their budget at all. I think it's over $450 million a year. He says he's slowly moving it under the control of the police, but it hasn't happened yet. And it's not due to happen now under his administration. It will have to wait for Eric Adams, who has intimated that he opposes that. What other issues could he have addressed? I'm sure that there are many others. There's still an overuse of standardized testing in our schools. He promised not to have high stakes testing or to move away from it as much as possible. And yet they are now spending this year $36 million on computerized standardized tests that will have to be given 3 times a year in every school, starting in kindergarten. The research on this is very weak, and that's twice as much as they want to spend on their class size pilot.
Well, thank you for those thoughts. We'll explore all these matters further in a bit. We're turning now to Jose Ortiz, There's nothing to me that's more emblematic of the two cities in New York between the amount of income and capital appreciation that goes to highly trained professional lawyers and bankers in New York City, and the struggles that everyday New Yorkers who are growing up in poor neighborhoods have in finding a good job that pays a living wage and that supports a family. And the Employment and Training Coalition has really been a key leader in thinking about more effective ways to do that. And so now we turn to Jose Ortiz to tell us a little bit about his work. And thank you very much, Leonie. We'll be back to you shortly.
Thanks, John, and thanks to SLUH for the invitation to speak today. Again, my name is Jose Ortiz Jr., and I'm the CEO of the New York City Employment and Training Coalition. Just a bit of overview on the organization before I answer any questions from John. ETC is the largest city-based workforce development association in the country, with over 180 members providing jobs and training for more than 500,000 New Yorkers. Our mission is to ensure that every New Yorker has access to the skills, training, and education needed to thrive in the local economy, and that every business is able to maintain a highly skilled workforce. For a bit more context on our work, ETC convenes stakeholders across the system, discovers and develops innovative solutions to create an interconnected and effective workforce, and advocates for equitable workforce development policies and investments at all levels of government that support people, community, and systems. So our work, we convene folks throughout over the course of the year. We host anywhere between a few dozen events, small, medium, large, that attract stakeholders that are from the job training provider, a membership that we are mostly consumed by or composed of, but also we attract folks that are leading business consortiums and small, medium, large businesses throughout New York City, elected and administration officials, funders, and individuals who are simply interested in engaging the workforce system. Our work and partners also work to discover kind of innovative ways to create a truly interconnected talent development system here in New York City. And over the course of our convenings, we learn about what the different opportunities are in order to advance the system and create a more effective structure that is going to benefit more workers here in New York City. And finally, in terms of advocacy, everything that we do is meant to inform that work. So our priorities always fall into three very distinct areas: people, community, and systems. We are obviously focused on every single individual who requires services here in New York City, and the workforce development system is built to support that. However, we are primarily advocating on ensuring that everyone in New York City, particularly marginalized populations, have access to quality skills training and effective employment services. From a community perspective, we are ensuring that and looking to always ensure that workforce and economic development are fundamentally connected, that they rely on each other, that when there is any economic development and or rezoning initiatives occurring across New York City, that people are fundamentally considered in the development of that neighborhood to ensure that they can grow with that community as well. And then finally,
maybe I could just pick up on that point that you're making. In the past, one of the main criticisms of economic development has been it supports business, but doesn't necessarily pay off in terms of jobs and upward mobility for everyday New Yorkers. So how do you think that's been going over the last 8 years? It's certainly something that the mayor has talked about, and rhetorically, even the New York City Economic Development Corporation has given some emphasis on the fact that the jobs need to be providing upward mobility for New Yorkers. But how would you assess that?
I think that it continues to be a flawed structure. I think the city, in theory, believes that anytime there is development in New York City, that it's ultimately going to serve the interests of the individuals that reside in the community by improving the quality of life and other aspects of that they're required. That are required for them to, not just survive here in New York City, but hopefully thrive. And that can't be achieved from our vantage point without ensuring that you are developing either skills training programs or creating an interconnected system that allows for folks that reside in that community to grow into potential jobs that will come online as the community is being developed. So it's not enough from our vantage point to provide affordable housing. It's not enough to build a new school. You have to ensure that the adults and out of school, out of work youth that reside in those communities have access to the jobs that will come online in the future. And there is simply not enough effort being made by the current administration to ensure that is occurring. Now, there have been strides and recent developments that have hopefully move us in that direction, but simply not enough work has been done. And we worked with, and this particular issue is a major concern of ours, which is why we partnered with the Association for Neighborhood Housing and Development and the Regional Plan Association to select a steering committee of emerging and diverse leaders across the city that represent economic development, housing, workforce development, but also a number of other intersectional areas that could help to inform a blueprint for how to do this more effectively in New York City. And that's called the New York City Inclusive Growth Initiative, which you can visit and receive more information on those recommendations at inclusivegrowth.nyc.
Great. Now let's turn to Julian Harris Calvin, who has worked on matters of the criminal justice system, particularly incarceration. And in one sense, some good things have happened over the past decade or so in that the total number of people incarcerated has been trending downward. But as we know from just the current news about what's going on at Rikers, that the system is still rife with problems and that people coming out of the criminal justice system are some of the most challenging clients and partners, for example, that Jose's organizations work with to try and integrate them effectively. So Julian, let's turn to you to ask a little bit about your work and also what you think has gone right and what has gone wrong in the past 8 years worth of efforts by the de Blasio administration in this area.
Yeah, thank you, John. And as you mentioned, Mayor de Blasio ran on strong progressive ideals that prioritize the existence and experiences of poor and marginalized New Yorkers. As mentioned by Lanny a little bit, there were some successes, like the establishment of universal pre-K, though she highlighted that they were not perfect. And we also saw some of those kinds of successes in the public safety realm. One example is the end of stop and frisk, the longtime NYPD policy that incentivized police officers to literally stop and frisk thousands of mostly Black and brown New Yorkers every day, not because of any legitimate suspicion of carrying weapons or drugs, but merely because of where they were and what they looked like. During his administration, there was expanded funding for alternatives to police interventions, such as the city's crisis management system, which is a network of nonprofit service providers in 21 precincts throughout the city, whose teams work to de-escalate disputes before crisis or violence erupts. And they also connect high-risk folks to extensive networks that provide job training, like Jose was talking about, employment opportunities, mental health services, and legal services to increase the likelihood of long-term violence reduction. And then a third example would be adoption of a plan to finally close the infamous Rikers Island jail complex that you mentioned, and we'll talk about more, and to replace the city's existing jails with smaller, borough-based facilities that meet minimum standards of care. We also, as you mentioned, John, saw crime and arrests plummet as compared to previous administrations. We are at 30-year lows across major crime groups, despite what you might be reading about in the Post. Murders are down 79% since Dinkins' term that you mentioned, John. Felony offenses are down 82%. And it is true, and I think we should keep in mind and address the fact that there was a spike in shootings and homicides last summer and this summer as compared to 2019. But overall, we are at 30-year historic lows. And arrests and misdemeanors are also down significantly over the course of the last decade, which was predominantly taken up with Mayor de Blasio's administration. Our jail population has decreased to the lowest it's been in recent history, as you mentioned, John, from 20,000 folks on Rikers Island in 1990, or in the 90s, to below 3,800 last April, though those numbers are ticking back up. So if we take all of these facts and figures at face value, de Blasio has stayed true to his ambitious progressive campaign promises. But it only takes a little scratch to reveal that below the surface, these feats, these successes, all were the result of years of momentum and advocacy that created a wave that Mayor de Blasio merely rode. In fact, he really had to get dragged, kicking and screaming to achieve much of this progress because he simply could not stand up to the incredible pushback he received from the NYPD and other law enforcement leaders. For example, de Blasio ran on putting an end to the racist stop and frisk practice, as I just mentioned, which really drove a wedge between him and the NYPD even before he was sworn in. So he did not actually end stop and frisk, though he tried to take credit for it. There was a lawsuit that predated him, and that lawsuit forced the city to end stop and frisk. But what did de Blasio do when he took office? He actually named Bill Bratton, the original architect of stop and frisk, as his police commissioner, which doesn't seem to make much sense unless you look at the broader context. Just after he took office, a sea of NYPD officers literally turned their backs on him when he came to pay respect to the family of a police officer who was shot in the line of duty. He also rubbed NYPD leaders the wrong way when he verbally empathized with protesters who mobilized after the police killings of Eric Gardner here in New York and Michael Brown in the Midwest. And since then, he's just bent over backwards to avoid the ire of the police department. And so, what does that look like? Despite nationwide protests after George Floyd's murder that led to calls for reinvesting policing dollars into non-law enforcement alternatives, the city promised to cut $1 billion from the NYPD's $11 billion budget. But alas, the budget remained intact, and actually the NYPD budget increased this fiscal year. Another example is the plan to close Rikers Island has already been delayed. And as you mentioned, John, as we'll talk about more, that plan has been delayed despite 12 deaths this year and inhumane conditions that include overflowing toilets, lack of sanitation, extreme violence, and people being denied food and prescription medicine. De Blasio will not accelerate decarceration in these circumstances or engage in what are going to be difficult negotiations with the corrections union regarding staffing and management issues that have plagued the agency for years and led us to this circumstance. So overall, even as a lame duck, he is not currently running for office, as we know, yet he is letting people die on Rikers Island for lack of basic care because he cannot stand up to traditional law enforcement lobby. And I think that alone speaks volumes about how successful his administration has been in achieving his very ambitious progressive goals that he espoused on his campaign. Oh, can't hear you, John.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much for that very insightful overview of what's been going on. Let's turn now to Professor Rodriguez, our colleague, to talk about what's been going on in neighborhood change, housing policy, gentrification, the plight of public housing. Mayor de Blasio made no secret of the fact that he felt that the only way to build quote unquote affordable housing was to promote private sector market rate development, with Atlantic Yards, as support for the Atlantic Yards project, being a strong example of how he would bring that about in office. And that's been very controversial because neighborhoods feel that the affordable housing is not particularly affordable and that the private market development might well raise rents and prices as more affluent people come into the neighborhood to reside in the market rate housing. Studies have shown that the law of supply and demand still works, in that if we add more units through the private market, it does provide some relief on the rent level, but the neighborhoods are still very, very uneasy about this. And James, you've been working on this for quite some time. Please share with us some of the findings that you've come to from your work.
Thanks, John. Thanks so much. Thanks so much to SLU and the public programming team and my colleagues on the panel. Yeah, thanks for opening up this context, John. And so I think there are a few different ways to read the de Blasio administration's track record on housing. And really, in fact, I want to pick up on a few threads that we heard from some of our other panelists, in particular, sort of the progressive ideals and framing of some of de Blasio's housing agenda, and then the policies that were implemented to sort of achieve that agenda. And then also its relationship with community groups around implementation and engagement around that process. And so part of what I want to do for my time is really think about the trajectory of the de Blasio administration in a few different key areas in housing, thinking about affordable housing, rezoning, and public housing in particular. But before we get into a few of those, I also want to talk about what has worked, I think, because like my colleague Leonie mentioned, I think there is a mixed legacy that we can take away from. And so I think some of the positive takeaways from this administration have been some of the anti-displacement measures that they've put into place, specifically around tenant harassment and support for legal services. So two specific examples are the right to counsel, which was 2017 legislation that essentially offers free legal representation for tenants facing eviction cases in housing court. And this was a major win for tenants in particular. Previously to this legislation, just 1% of tenants were legally represented in housing court. I think that number, even in the still early implementation of this legislation, is around 40%. In contrast, landlords are represented 95% of the time in housing court. So there was a major imbalance around particularly eviction cases and legal representation. And in fact, de Blasio administration also moved up some of their implementation around right to counsel. They moved up some of their deadlines due to the pandemic. So I thought that was a really good example of the administration sort of rising to the moment. It does bear mentioning that a lot of this legislation was also, as my colleague Julian mentioned, built on the backs of many years of advocacy and organizing by community groups, and the Right to Counsel Coalition in particular has been instrumental in sort of pushing that legislation and building support for that movement. But another really good example is the Certificate of No Harassment, which was 2018 legislation, or that came through a pilot program, which was really thinking about the relationships, I think, of private market housing renovation, and then the financial incentive that many landlords had to displace tenants or harass tenants through required renovations. And so the Certificate of No Harassment essentially required building owners to meet certain requirements, ensuring that tenant harassment hasn't taken place in the past, in order to get permits for renovation from the Department of Buildings. And so, again, I think this was really useful legislation that really was able to interrupt sort of the profit incentive that some of the existing legislation allowed for landlords to use to harass tenants out of their units. But again, it also bears mentioning that this legislation was crafted really in part through a large coalition, the Coalition Against Tenant Harassment, which was also coordinated by ANHD, the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development. So I was glad to hear a shout out from them earlier on the panel by my colleague, Jose. So while I think those are some really good examples of some really positive changes that were implemented and wins for tenants and residents that were implemented under this current administration, I think that there's another dynamic that we can read through a few of the different policy initiatives that ultimately were mixed, fell short, or in even some instances possibly exacerbated some of the market tensions and market forces that have really been driving up rents and in turn displacement in many communities around New York City. And so I think some of those efforts are around the affordable housing push, around building and preserving affordable housing. And so this was an early housing initiative from the de Blasio administration in 2014, near the start of his administration, known as the Housing New York Plan. And this also came with really sort of progressive language around framing the problems of New York City affordable housing in the language of crisis, which I think also is going to set up another dynamic that I think really alludes to some of the disappointment or dissatisfaction that you alluded to, John, that maybe has grown over the 2 terms of the de Blasio administration, which is really, in my view, the sort of disconnect between some of the rhetoric around both the understanding and the language of crisis, and then the way that some of these policy implementations fell short in ultimately serving the working poor of New York City that were bearing the brunt of this crisis most intensely and most severely. And so that Housing New York plan in 2014 set really ambitious goals quantitatively around creating or preserving 200,000 affordable housing units over 10 years. And on that score, the administration has largely been successful. In fact, they've met that deadline early, 2 years early, in fact, and have expanded that goal. But as we heard from my colleague Julian, if you kind of scratch the surface of some of these kind of numerical wins for housing policy, I think that the picture becomes a little bit more complicated. And so in particular, already that framing around building and preserving housing and using that combined metric as a way to define success for a housing policy, I think was a questionable metric for success and criteria for effective housing policy. And then even the language of affordable housing, I think, has become open for debate and contest over the tenure of this administration in particular. And so I think we've seen that play out in what has shaped up to be several intense and fierce political contest and community conflict around the implementation of policies around the Housing New York goal that were progressive and affordable in rhetoric, but as you mentioned, when we get a little bit deeper, not actually affordable for many of the working residents and the poor residents in the communities that were targeted for this development. And so a few examples there were that citywide rezoning that took place also early in its administration, known as mandatory inclusionary housing, and then zoning for quality and affordability, so MIH or ZQA. And so again, on the surface, this sounds like a good idea, mandating increased affordable housing production in upzoning, as you mentioned, trying to take advantage of the laws of supply and demand by creating and incentivizing more housing and mandating affordable housing alongside that. But despite that, and despite the ongoing affordability crisis, these plans received really massive pushback, really across New York City in multiple ways. And so community boards across the 5 boroughs overwhelmingly voted in a majority and often unanimously to reject these proposals. The votes for many of these proposals in City Council inspired really intense and militant forms of direct action as ways to sort of disrupt the votes, which I think are a real kind of indicator about the ways that this plan, while again nominally a good idea, ultimately would fall short from serving the most impacted and vulnerable folks. And so I'm going to drop another quick link in the chat. It's one I didn't provide to Nadia and Michael, so apologies for calling it audible there. But it's actually a piece of data and report that was compiled by Marika Williams, who's the current executive director of ANHD and who will be joining us. I'm very excited to moderate on our housing justice panel in October. So shameless plug for that. But I think part of what we see here is that under the very questionable quantitative ways to think about affordability using things like the area median income or AMI, were ways that the administration was able to sort of set its own goalposts around claiming success or effectiveness around housing policy in ways that still ultimately, again, didn't serve many of the most vulnerable communities that were suffering the impacts of this housing crisis, and were also not being met by the housing production of the private market. And so we've seen that in the citywide rezoning. I think we've seen this in local rezonings that were playing out in places like East New York, which is currently fighting a cease and desist zone in East New York, or residents have put forward a cease and desist zone and advocated for that injunction in order to sort of head off rampant real estate speculation as a result of the upzoning in that community. I think we see similar dynamics in Inwood, another rezoning that is mired in litigation that was actually overturned and is now being appealed. So I think there are a lot of indications as well that community groups and residents were really quite dissatisfied with some of the proposals that came out of the Blasio administration, in particular in the early years of their first term. And so I think by and large, many of these proposals were implemented regardless of this really severe and fierce community backlash. And I think that also played a large part in sort of souring some of the relations, particularly the expectations that folks had going into that administration. And so alongside thinking about some of the progressive ideals that framed the administration, I think the larger context is the previous administration and how even the framing of this panel around Tale of Two Cities was some language that was echoed during that campaign. And in many ways, I think that this administration has messaged itself as sort of a departure from that Bloomberg era. But in many ways, I think these policies, particularly the over-reliance on the private market and incentivizing new development, in many ways gone farther than the Bloomberg administration in terms of providing more affordability, but still in ways that fell short. Have also revealed the ways that the two administrations on housing were maybe more alike than they were dissimilar. And so again, I think that may have been part of the root of the dissatisfaction. And outside of rezoning, I think we see really similar dynamics for how they approach public housing, which is another kind of bitter pill and an irony for folks that were working in housing and public housing around this time. In particular, housing groups and public housing organizations really organized in the waning days of the Bloomberg administration to forestall their plan for public housing, which really looked like an 80-20 market rate affordable split model. And part of their campaign strategy was to push for getting this new revisioning for public housing to be undertaken by the Blasio administration rather than the outgoing Bloomberg administration. And then so a year later, also in the midst of the sort of rezoning battles of 2014 and 2015, you get next generation NYCHA that comes out of the de Blasio administration that in many ways, despite the next generation frame, was really built on a lot of that same architecture of the Bloomberg plan, which featured looking towards private market developers to build new housing on public housing communities, featuring a portion of affordable housing, usually 30%, sometimes as much as 50%, still never a majority. And then again, as we've alluded to, affordability that actually was not truly affordable, right? Which has led to even that framing and that contest of affordability to be something that has been a deep part of the debate. And so alongside that, I think they've actually doubled down besides some of the criticism and the backlash around public housing in particular. While they did a lot to kind of implement community engagement programs, similarly to the rezoning, public housing residents and groups have really voiced their dissatisfaction in ways that have not necessarily interrupted this process.
So we've had 4 perspectives on what's some of the things that have gone right and many of the things that have gone wrong. And I think we would be remiss if we didn't say that the COVID pandemic and the loss of tens of thousands of our sister and fellow neighbors' lives and the loss of employment and the distress that has spread throughout the city and our struggles to recover have made a lot of these problems both more visible and worse in some respects. So I take away from the conversation so far, number one, that these are deeply embedded problems, challenges that are not easy to fix. If they were easy to fix, probably they would have been fixed a long time ago. One of the reasons they're hard to fix is that there are many entrenched interests that don't want to see things change, and it's difficult to overcome those entrenched interests. And it takes both leadership from the top and mobilization from the below to be able to make some progress against them. And also, there are probably things that we should be trying that we haven't tried, that a lot of our solutions, as James just said about housing, are built within the parameters of the past, and it's difficult sometimes to think outside of the box. So now I'd like to shift to a broader discussion of, given that situation, what do we take away about what can be built on? What do we take away about new directions, really substantially new directions that the next administration should should follow, and how can we all, participate in making that happen? Clearly, if you look at the details of the Democratic mayoral primary that took place in June, Eric Adams was nominated by the mobilization of relatively poor and working class Black and brown neighborhoods in New York City, and he prevailed against candidates that were supported by much better off people, better educated people. So he has a lot on the line in terms of being able to deliver for the people that have nominated him, and likely he'll be elected to be our next mayor. So I'm wondering what thoughts, realistic thoughts, you have given the depths of the problems, but learning from what we can from the past 8 years in terms of which new direction should we really rank highest in what we would recommend to the new administration. And everybody should feel free to chime in, and also if you have comments, thoughts, reactions to what other speakers have said, please share those as well. Julian, maybe I could just break the ice and call on you to give some thoughts.
Sure. Just to the question of what should the next administration be looking to do to improve upon the last?
Whatever you would like to, what direction would you like to point us in, given the complex state of the situation that we've laid out here?
Yes, we've laid out a pretty inspiring yet disheartening context for the conversation. I think if we start with you having brought up that we'll probably have Eric Adams as the next mayor, and he certainly didn't run on as progressive a platform as de Blasio, from what I am hearing from all the other panelists, did not realize a lot of those goals or ambitions. And yet the city apparently is fine with that by having, at least in the criminal justice context, we are likely have elected a cop. So just to be frank. And so if I could speak in at least the criminal justice sense about, what that comes from or what that might mean. I think for the criminal justice and the public safety sense, I think it means that, folks who were unhappy with the progressive goals of the de Blasio administration, folks who were, from our sense, the more tough on crime, the more moderate conservative end of the spectrum, who were off-put by the uprising nationally around race and racial justice, around the pushback against police brutality, the calls for defunding, or whatever the language is you want to use, divest, invest, defund, budget justice, folks who are saying like, look, policing is not working. Our traditional structures are inherently racist. Those would have been extreme conversations, 5-10 years ago. And they are part of the mainstream conversation now. And so I think having Eric Adams having been essentially elected mayor shows that I think the kind of the pushback that we got to those conversations, those uber progressive conversations that have arisen post de Blasio's election, show that fear has worked in convincing folks that we've just gone a little too far with these progressive goals, I would say. And so, other candidates, at least in the criminal justice sense, they had really ambitious evidence-based proposals for prioritizing non-law enforcement, non-incarcerative interventions and responses to public safety that are similar to what we've seen in other jurisdictions. And yet they didn't win, right? The more traditional police officer, traditional like law enforcement, traditional structures that many are calling inherently racist and needing reform, that guy won, right? And so it's interesting when the data show that those other alternative programs that have been piloted across the country do a better job of preventing and decreasing gun crime and gun violence and gun homicides, which is what has been going up, though the rest of the other categories of crime have gone down. In Richmond, California's Advanced Peace Program had resulted in 85% reduction in firearm assaults, 65% reduction in related homicides. Here in New York City, our Save Our Streets program in Crown Heights led to 20% less gun violence than in adjacent police precincts. There was a study in Chicago that found a 31% drop in homicides and 19% drop in shootings in communities where violence interrupters were prioritized as opposed to traditional policing. But that didn't help folks win. I think that shows that fear-mongering and misinformation as a backlash to progressive ambitions have been successful and continue to be successful. Did that answer your question, John, or did I just go?
Yeah, definitely addresses it. I mean, I think, the city is definitely still two cities in terms of who's benefiting and who's hurting. But I think your point that some of the ideas from progressives about how really to advance social justice haven't necessarily, found strong support in many of the audiences and neighborhoods and constituencies that supported Eric Adams. And, I think politically when working class Black and Latino neighborhoods see eye to eye with white liberal, educated, progressive, Park Slope types like, where I live, that can be a majority coalition, and that was the de Blasio coalition. But where they don't see eye to eye, it means that under progressive ideas face much greater challenge. And at the same time, it seems to me that the Adams administration electorally has to make it its number one goal to advance the interests of the constituencies that voted for it, which were also the constituencies that all four of our talks have said have not been sufficiently well served by the de Blasio administration, which came into office saying that they were going to take very substantial steps forward. So it'll just be very interesting to see how this plays out in the coming 4 years. Leonie, I wonder if I can turn back to you. Education is the single biggest, public K-12 education is the single biggest item in the city budget. As you indicated in your talk, there's more flows of resources that are available to come in to the system. What would you like to see the next administration put at the top of its agenda? I mean, obviously, I guess we could say class size reduction is going to be one of them. But more broadly, what initiatives would you like to see them take?
Well, I'd like to focus my remarks mostly on what my hopes are for the Adams administration and what the warning signs are. As I said before, I think the number one priority of any mayor should be to lower class size, because that's a key driver for equity and one of the very few things that have been proven to work to improve student outcomes. We have some warning signs. He hasn't, in his campaign, I don't think Adams said anything specifically on class size. Instead, he made one comment during a debate, which he also made in his overall campaign plan, that he would focus on having longer school years, including thousands of kids on computers during the summer, which, of course, created a big backlash. And he had to sort of take it back, because if there's one thing that the pandemic has proven, that putting thousands of kids on computers does not work. And he meant that he wouldn't have to hire many teachers, because one teacher would teach thousands of kids at once on the computer. The other warning sign is his support for charter schools, which is a strong plank in his administration and his campaign overall. He got a lot of hefty donations from the charter school lobby and the hedge fund crowd that support an expansion of charter schools, which do not make it easier to actually improve our public schools, but harder because they are now draining more than $2.4 billion a year out of the DOE's budget, plus another 100 million or more for charter school rent, which we are the only district in the state and indeed the country that is legally obligated to help pay for charter schools in private spaces if we do not give them space in our public schools. However, if Eric Adams wants to do something that has clearly positive results for the people who elected him, is politically popular among every group in the city, including conservatives, independents, and Republicans on Staten Island, and has not been tried, I don't see what he has in his potential arsenal except for lowering class size. So now that de Blasio has made his reputation on pre-K, I really don't see that there's anything less that has been both proven to work to narrow the achievement gap, really improve the quality of education in a fundamental way, especially for the majority of kids in our public schools who are in poverty, Black or Latinx. So I'm hoping that he understands that. He is also going to be having to deal with the extremely progressive city council that is made up of a majority of women for the first time, and I think a majority of people of color. If not, I'm pretty sure. And so he will have to contend with them as well. And I'm hoping that they will be as progressive as their campaigns made out. There are a number of people who were elected, who were former teachers, and also former activists on education, who I imagine will fight hard for those sorts of goals.
Thank you for that. And also, we'd love for the audience to begin posting questions of their own in the Q&A. And while we look for some of those, maybe I could turn to Jose briefly. Obviously, how well the K-12 public education system works and how well CUNY works has a very direct bearing on what the job prospects for young people are in New York City. And I wonder if you also could reflect on what your agenda for the school system and even for CUNY as well would be for the coming years.
Yeah, I mean, there's a clear direct correlation between the education and workforce development system. And unfortunately, those two pieces don't work as effectively together on a frequent basis. And I think there's a variety of reasons for that. But I also want to just reflect a little bit, I think, in terms of how we approach this discussion around, what the future looks like. I mean, I do think that one of the things that we, even in listing some of the priorities that we're listing, and I'll, of course, list my priorities within the workforce development sector. I think one of the things that the voting population said first and foremost during this period of time is that we needed to prioritize a very diverse list of priorities across different spaces and not really take the siloed approach that we often do take in these discussions. And that to me is increasingly clear that people want a discussion that includes housing and jobs and education and all of these different pieces. But it doesn't appear to me that any one of those is much more fundamentally important than the other. And I think, obviously from a jobs discussion, I think we need to do a better job of linking K through 12 and higher education to that discussion on a more frequent basis. And so I think for a few specific recommendations that I would, talk through, and again, as I mentioned previously, we break down our recommendations in terms of people, community, and systems. I think from a talent perspective and a community-based perspective, we need to really think about how we're developing local talent pipelines more effectively. And one of the ways that we've seen success across the nation and in other states in doing this and raising funds to support this is by creating a permanent workforce development fund that is based on tax levy or allocating a specific percentage of workforce economic development dollars for the purposes of workforce development training. We don't do that here in our city. Majority of our dollars, as you know, from a workforce standpoint, are dependent on federal funds via WIOA that are allocated for very specific programs, and we just simply have not developed the local talent pipeline that we would hope for, because New York City is so incredibly attractive to different businesses and different folks that we do generate the best talent in the world, and there's just less incentive to develop our local talent. So we've advocated for around 10% of economic development funds, and this is something that we'd be willing to work towards something even something achievable, but developing a fund that is allocated for that distinct purpose. We've talked through ways to create more, investing in more subsidized employment for individuals in the city, more programs around on-ramps. And these are things that we've advocated for a long time, and is, in our eyes, the biggest failure of the workforce of the de Blasio administration's workforce development plans has been the lack of investment in bridge programs, pre-apprenticeship programs, ESOL, high school equivalency programs, because that, for us, has been a way that we can ensure that the most marginalized populations are included in the job training discussion, particularly because of the fact that many of these individuals lack some of the basic skills around literacy and numeracy that are required for them to be successful on the job. And unfortunately, the de Blasio administration never really lived up to the fundamental promises around investing in that. But I think one of the other pieces that I want to highlight is that the system itself, with regards to workforce, is incredibly fractured here in New York. It is there are programs, and you can find this in the work that we did with our partners at NIATAP, which is the New York Association for Training and Employment Professionals, and Jobs First NYC, New York City, in a report called Follow the Money. And you'd see that there are about 22 different agencies in New York City that are responsible for work around workforce development, and therefore have dollars that are allocated for that. We don't have an employment agency like we've had in the past. It's spread out throughout all these different agencies and programs. And in effect, because it's the priority of all these different agencies, it becomes the priority of no one. And is an administration that is not dedicated and committed to a priority like workforce development is able to allow for it to kind of go under the rug and not be as impactful. And for the next administration, we're hopeful that they'll take, again, to my earlier point, a much more holistic approach around connecting economic development, workforce development, and housing, and all these other intersectional areas that I think are really vitally important. Justice involvement is important for folks in the community. Issues around K through 12 and class size is fundamentally important to folks, but so is food security, so is infrastructure, issues around accessibility for folks who are disabled. If you are, 40 minutes away from a train stop, there's a direct correlation between your ability to succeed and or survive and thrive in this city. So we have to address all these different issues comprehensively and take an approach that is not simply talking about one of these issues over the other, but really a collective vision that really speaks to the average individual in New York City, who I believe thinks more holistically.
James, you've spent a lot of time understanding life in public housing projects, understanding life in the Black and brown neighborhoods around public housing projects. What would you like to see what do you think those communities would like to see the Adams administration deliver for them that would really make a substantial difference in improving life?
Yeah, that's a good question, John. And I think to sort of highlight some of the kind of missteps or the mixed legacy of the de Blasio administration alongside what a vision for the future may be for the Adams administration, particularly around race and class and housing, I think the Adams administration can sort of take some lessons out of some of the sort of early contests that I mentioned earlier around, for example, zoning and local rezoning in the de Blasio administration that really kind of soured relations between community groups. resident groups, housing activists and advocates in particular, and really think about what the community-based alternatives are. And so while on issues like affordable housing and public housing in particular, we're often being messaged that really nothing's able to be done without massive private market investment. I think that kind of obscures the role of really deep, fierce, and sharp organizing and activism on the base of community groups and grassroots or organizations that have really showed us otherwise. And so groups like Fight for NYCHA, like the Justice for All Coalition, the United Front Against Displacement, the Chinatown Working Group, have all put down different sort of alternatives to sort of, for example, expanding a commitment to public housing. And so to respond also in kind to a question I saw in the chat about the role of like progressive shared ownership models, like community land trusts. I think that's an excellent idea, and the de Blasio administration has actually some limited experience here in places like East Harlem in particular. But outside of thinking about, for example, forming, creating, and expanding community land trust, I think we should also flip that conversation and think about the investment in public lands that we already have, particularly in public housing. And so in the waning days of the de Blasio administration, we get this new blueprint for NYCHA that's essentially calling for massive Section 8 conversions that would allow and open the door for private market administration and property management, as well as essentially dissolve NYCHA as an agency as we know it and replacing it instead with a public benefit corporation, which have been even less open to oversight and regulation and resident governance and leadership than even existing government agencies. And I think that has really, really major implications for not only the future of public housing communities and housing in the city, but really for the life and health of public housing residents. And we saw this with the lead scandal that emerged in the waning days of the de Blasio administration, where thousands of children were impacted by lead poisoning in ways that were also obscured and not necessarily transparent. And so to return to what folks may want to see from the Adams administration is a real investment in the lives of Black and Brown working folks, be it their safe habitation in public housing free from chronic conditions like mold and lead poisoning, but also a different orientation to a political culture that, for example, in the de Blasio administration, really forcefully clashed with community groups that took issue with some of their policies. I think the Adams administration would be well served to go in a different direction and take very seriously the grassroots and community-based alternatives around, for example, a people's budget, again, local rezoning, community-based rezoning initiatives, and other alternatives for using public subsidy in ways that will invest in our existing public infrastructure rather than opening it up for further private market encroachment. I think the warning signs are not great on that. Eric Adams has already come out in statements towards the business and the Wall Street community with phrases like New York will no longer be anti-business. So I think that some of the battles over the de Blasio administration, as I think my colleague on the panel, Julian, alluded to, and the rise of the potential or incoming Adams administration reflects sort of a backlash against some of the more progressive goals that were really starting to pick up steam in different aspects of the de Blasio administration. So I fear a retrenchment in many ways, but I think in a way that will very likely lead to even fiercer political debate and conflict and contest. So again, I would really like to see the Adams administration take the alternatives and the solutions being brought up by grassroots and community organizations seriously and implement them as policy.
One of the questions in the chat, which goes to the really right to the core of our discussion, is why did the de Blasio administration fail to deliver on its progressive promises to the extent where it did and how much it did? Obviously, it did deliver on some of those promises. And so I'd like towards the end here to get to, do you think that this is because the problems are just intrinsically extremely difficult to deal with, and it would be hard for anyone, even the most competent and strongly backed administration? Or is it because of a lack of unified desire to accomplish a goal within the administration? Or is it a result of some interests or, vested interests that don't want to see change, or interests that somehow influenced in the de Blasio administration in a way that we didn't anticipate that they would at the outset? And I think that goes to the question of, what really are the politics from the base that are necessary to lead administration to be able to be effective in advancing a progressive agenda across many different fronts. Perhaps to some extent, it's not just the administration's fault, but it's our shortcomings as well in terms of being able to build that political base. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that set of questions. And Julian, since you sharply made this point about the fact that progressive ideas did not win this last election, at least as far as policing and the criminal justice system goes, I wonder if you might take a first crack at that.
Well, that's a tough question. But I think at least, and I don't have the expertise that my co-panelists do in other contexts. So as Jose mentioned, and James too, there are intersections, and the same demographic of New Yorkers are affected by his administration's failure to achieve the full potential of his stated goals at his campaign. I mentioned at the outset that, he just did not want to fight the traditional law enforcement structure. It's really hard. It's hard. It's a big fight. And to your point that lots of Black and brown folks in poor communities, over-policed communities, communities that were stopped and frisked, voted for Adams as what James and I were saying is part of this backlash to this ambitious progressive ideals. And I think it's because the solutions to the problems that we've all mentioned, the path to achieve those ambitious progressive goals requires nuanced solutions. They're nuanced solutions, they're multifaceted solutions, they're interdisciplinary, as Jose was mentioning. And folks want answers now, right? And to have that interdisciplinary approach and gather that coalition takes time and effort and a lot of diplomacy. And this is just my opinion, but when people in your neighborhood are being shot and killed, you don't have time for long-term diplomacy and like these high-level conversations that we're having at a graduate program, right? You want to make sure that your kids are safe. And so having what feels like easy solutions, like having the police fan out into your community, despite some of the harms, it makes you feel safer. And it feels more palatable than these like broader discussions about, the multifaceted solutions to the everyday problems people are facing. I hope that wasn't too abstract, but I think like that's what makes it hard to really push in one term or two terms these progressive norms, is that you have a lot of pushback from the institutional structures you're trying to reform and change and maybe even get rid of and replace, while you also have a constituency that's like, I need answers now. I need to make sure these shootings are happening today. I don't really care about your long-term, like highfalutin descriptions about all the many ways we could come to the solutions I need today.
One of the questions from the audience was addressed specifically to James and Jose, was should we have accepted the Amazon offer to locate a new headquarters in Long Island City? And in general, we also saw in Industry City a desire to develop a shoreline property at much greater volume and intensity than in the past. And a key question was who would get those jobs? And as we climb out of our recession driven by the COVID crisis, the question of investment and who gains from investment is going to be front and center. And so I wonder what we can say about how to have, instead of having just conflict between pro and anti-development forces that leads to a kind of trench warfare, whether there's a possibility of something that will, a new arrangement that will, benefit both sides and lead to growth that is inclusive. And if so, how do we make that happen? James, Jose, do you want to comment?
I'll jump in. So I think a few things. I think one, I think speaking to the degree of nuance that I think also we heard from some of our other panelists. I think that's also necessary when we think about the current development environment and as well as the kind of community organizing that happens around that. And so community organizers and housing activists haven't actually been anti-development. They've really been focusing on development that would be largely unaffordable to folks that actually need housing in their communities, and ways that incentivized or facilitated development also opens the door to increase speculation and future development also in other parts of the private market where the city administration has less power. And so thinking about the Amazon deal in particular, I think that's a really good example. And so my answer is really an emphatic no, they absolutely should not. And in fact, phrasing or framing it thinking as like an Amazon offer, I think also kind of flips the actual power dynamics that were behind that entire proposal, which is to say New York City was actually making the offer. And that offer came with billions upon billions of tax subsidy given to Amazon, quite literally the most profitable corporation on the face of the earth. And so I think that's a real example of how thinking, especially from grassroots solutions, that there actually is money in the budget for a number of different ways to invest in affordable housing, in permanent housing for homelessness and folks that are unhoused, and truly preserving public housing and in fact expanding it. And so whether it was the billions of dollars that were promised to Amazon or that have already been implemented through developments like Atlantic Yards, Hudson Yards, the proposed Sunnyside Yards, just to name a few, there are billions of dollars of revenue or potential subsidy that is within the grasp of the city. And really what's often chosen to be done is providing that to private developers as a way to incentivize their developments, which, as we can think about with the Amazon example, would not necessarily actually provide the jobs for many folks that are, again, in the working class and poor folks in New York City that make up nearly 30% of the city, over the majority of the folks that are rent burdened or paying more than 30% of their rent or percent of their income on housing costs. And instead would kind of continue some of that segmentation. And so I think that was really at the root of many of the kind of criticisms of the proposed housing plans. And I think that Amazon deal was a really good example of them. And in fact, the fact that it didn't go through is also a really great example of tenant power and local organizing that was able to actually get a win in this instance. And so, yeah, I think that was a real benefit to the city and to Queens in particular.
Can I say something about the Amazon deal? Because it relates to education. It was a terrible deal. As we've seen, Amazon has added thousands of new jobs to New York City. Google is in the process of adding thousands of new jobs to New York City, including buying a new building for over $3 billion without any tax subsidies whatsoever. And additionally, that deal depended on the city giving away a lot of city-owned space, including a DOE building, which for years the community, which has severely overcrowded schools in Long Island City, has been pushing to be made into a school instead. And that was part of the deal that was going to be given to Amazon, which, as James said, is the most profitable corporation on the face of the earth, to create part of their headquarters. So it was a terrible deal. High tech has continued to expand in New York City without any tax subsidies at all, and city-owned land and buildings, especially where schools are already badly overcrowded, should be prioritized for public uses like public schools.
Jose, though, you have organized a coalition that includes both business leaders and educators and community members to devise a plan for inclusive development. Where do you see that shining light for our future path? Because clearly we would like to see these different interests working together in a progressive way rather than fighting each other. But maybe fighting is all we can do. I don't know. What do you see developing from your effort?
Yeah, I'm certainly more optimistic in terms of how we can potentially find a way for businesses and people to operate in the city. And I think in part because we see from a workforce development standpoint, we see ourselves as distinctly different than just traditionally the human services sector or the business community. We see ourselves as the intersection between people receiving that training and getting a good job and being able to survive in the city. So for us, it's about effectively moving the discussion forward so that we can ensure that when jobs do come online in the city, that anyone and everyone who's interested in exploring careers or jobs in those spaces has the ability to adequately serve the employer well and also continue to be a part of the fabric of the city. And so that can't be done by having a one side or two-sided discussion. We need to bring folks to the table to have a discussion on how to progressively move this discussion forward. So from a vantage point of our coalition, our organization, we work with small businesses, SMBs, we work with large businesses, but much of our work is to sit down with them and understand what are their talent needs, really taking a more thoughtful approach to how we conduct our training for individuals within these nonprofits and within CUNY and other institutions throughout the city. So if an employer is specifically looking for talent, what is it that they need, so we can better inform our job training providers on the credentials, the training itself, how to explore those career pathways for the individuals that they're currently serving. And I think the future city requires us as these organizations, human services and businesses alike, to work collaboratively and cooperate together. I also, however, I'm excited to hear, some of the questions around, co-ops and things of that nature. I think those are really incredible opportunities for, individuals in the city to, create something on their own and to build power and wealth for individual communities and families. So there are lots of different ways to approach this discussion, but I think there is a productive manner that we can move forward in the city and within the next administration that brings businesses into the discussion, but also doesn't talk about it from the perspective of, major incentives or things that might alienate certain portions of the population that are not inclined to support that way of working with businesses.
Thank you very much for that. As we wind down our time here, we'll be turning it back over to the organizers in a minute for a few announcements and follow-on activities for the Urban Academy students. But let me say this has been a very thoughtful, penetrating, insightful discussion about both what we would aspire to do and the difficulties we face in making progress on the goals that we would like to advance. None of these problems is easy, and all of them are interrelated, and we can't solve one of them if we don't also attend to the other closely linked issues. I think that comes clearly out of our discussion. One thing I think we all agree on, or actually two things, is that we need to be talking to each other. The grassroots movements across all these different issue areas have to be talking to each other so that we're not just sitting in our silos, but that we see how our part of positive social change can be linked to the other areas. And also that the system has a lot of lethargy built into it, a resistance to change, and we really have to organize vigorously across all these fronts to put pressure on it. Leadership can't change things at the top if it doesn't have a base pushing it in the right directions, and I think that comes very clearly out of our conversation. If any of you have very short last words that you would like to share alongside these words, please do so now, and then we'll turn it back to our organizers. And let me say thanks to everyone for all the thought and care they put into this discussion.
Well, I want to thank you guys for inviting me. I learned a lot from the presentations of the other speakers. And if people want to get in touch with me and my organization about the issue of class size and school overcrowding, you can email us at info@classsizematters.org and check out our website for updates. There is a bill introduced in the City Council that has now more than half of the council members signed on as co-sponsors, which would radically decrease the capacity of classrooms, and by that require much smaller classes. We hope to get that passed before this council turns over to an almost entirely new council. But thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you for participating. Any other thoughts? I really want to thank you for all of the really insightful and nuanced discussion that you've given all of these issues. I think sometimes in our frustration, it's easy to kind of make a little bit of a poster out of the mayor and say, he promised he was going to do X, Y, and Z, and he didn't do it, and we're really mad at him as a result. And I understand why people have that reaction, but I also know that the mayor brought a tremendous number of strong advocacy leaders from the different fields that we're talking about into city government, and they've spent 8 years of their lives working with everybody in the community, striving to get change, and many important, maybe smaller scale, less heralded, less visible things have happened. So we shouldn't leave the conversation just with a completely negative and downbeat attitude, where we're not looking. Many good, small, and important things have gotten done. And in the whole, I judge that to be a real success, given the depths of the challenges that the administration faces. So again, thanks to the School of Labor and Urban Studies for organizing this discussion. It's a wonderful place to tune in and learn more about the key issues facing the city. It's a very necessary conversation for all of us to have, and to thank you for each of the participants today for sharing your very deep knowledge about these different areas. So I'll turn it back over to the organizers now, and thank you very much. And please do tune in for the forthcoming programs, including the one that James will help us with shortly.